Story 1. Midnight Visitor. At 22, John had settled into the downstairs apartment of his parents' house, seeking a balance of independence and savings. Despite their frequent absences, he often felt the shadow of their presence, especially when it came to having friends over. The apartment was small and open, with a kitchen seamlessly connected to the living area and his bedroom, bathroom, and laundry room tucked down a hallway. One Saturday, after a long day out with friends, John returned home late at night. He wasn't intoxicated, having spent the day more like a marathon than a party. Exhausted, he grabbed a quick snack, washed up, and crawled into bed, turning on the TV for a bit of distraction. As he switched it off, the familiar creaks and thumps from above caught his attention. Footsteps, echoing from the kitchen upstairs. Initially, he brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the house settling. But as he lay there, the sound stopped, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Suddenly, the doorknob to his bedroom began to turn. John shot up, adrenaline coursing through him. The knob twisted for a few seconds, then a light knock followed. Panic set in as he reached for his phone, frantically texting his family and friends, hoping one of them would respond. His parents were unreachable, likely fast asleep, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Not daring to call out, he quietly slipped out of bed and hid behind a dresser, clutching a blunt object in case the intruder forced their way in. Minutes felt like hours as he remained frozen in place, the silence amplifying his fear. Finally, he whispered to the 911 operator, waiting in dread until help arrived. When the police showed up, John guided them to his bedroom window. Thankful he was on the first floor, he handed one of the officers the key to the side door. Moments later, he heard the entrance to his apartment creak open. Heart racing, he cautiously emerged to find two officers inside. They quickly lit up the small space, searching for any signs of danger. After a thorough check of the apartment, they moved upstairs. As they entered his parents' room, John heard a commotion, a mix of voices echoing through the house. When the officers finally returned, they escorted a tall, disheveled man in a sweatshirt and shorts down the stairs. The sight of him sent a wave of nausea through John. He had never seen this man before. When asked if he recognized him, John firmly replied, "Of course not." The man shot him a look filled with malice that haunted him long after he left. Once the police assured him everything was safe, John felt a weight lift. They explained that if he or his parents wanted to follow up, they should call the precinct after their departure. That night, as he lay in bed, John texted every family member and friend he could think of, but only a few responded, given the late hour. The next morning, John called his parents to recount the bizarre events. They were understandably shocked, but since nothing had been stolen and the man appeared to be homeless, they chose not to pursue any legal action. As John reflected on the night, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Had he left the front door unlocked when Jay and Anthony came over? If so, the man could have simply walked in while they were lost in their music. Or worse, he could have been in the house for much longer, lurking in the shadows, completely unnoticed. Story 2. The Cabin's Secret. After years of bustling city life, Emily sought solace in a remote cabin nestled deep within the woods. The first few months were blissful, filled with tranquil fishing trips and evenings spent by the crackling fire. The isolation had become her sanctuary, a perfect escape from the chaos of urban living. One night, while stargazing from her porch, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping emanating from the back of the cabin. Initially, she dismissed it as a branch brushing against the wood, a mere figment of her imagination. But as the days turned into nights, the unsettling sound grew louder and more persistent. Curiosity gnawed at her. One evening, she grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, the beam slicing through the darkness. It flickered across the trees, illuminating nothing but shadowy silhouettes. Just as she turned to retreat, she noticed that the back door was ajar, an ominous invitation. Heart racing, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin felt cold and empty, a stark contrast to the warmth she had come to know. Then she heard the tapping again, this time echoing from the basement. With trepidation, she descended the creaky stairs, the flashlight's beam trembling in her hand. At the bottom, she found a hidden door she had never noticed before. It creaked open, revealing a dusty room filled with forgotten furniture and a strange symbol carved into the wall. The air felt heavy, thick with an unshakable tension. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the door behind her, trapping Emily in darkness. Panic surged through her as she realized the tapping had been a warning all along. Something in that basement was meant to remain hidden, and she had just awakened it, unleashing forces she could never have imagined. As she stood frozen in fear, the shadows around her seemed to come alive, whispering secrets from a time long past. The cabin, once a refuge, had transformed into a place of dread, and Emily knew she had to escape before it was too late. Story 3. Echoes of Fear. Mark lived in a 2-floor house with his sister. It was a mother-daughter setup, which meant there were 2 kitchens, one for each of them. His sister occupied the downstairs, while he took the upstairs. She wasn't home much, often spending nights with her boyfriend who lived 20 miles away. At 30 years old, Mark felt he shouldn't be spooked by being home alone, but sometimes the silence weighed heavily on him. One particular night, he settled in to watch a scary movie. The open layout of the house made the living room, dining room, and kitchen feel like one vast space. With the couch positioned in the center, Mark found himself facing a large area behind him, the darkness palpable. As he sat there, the flickering light from the TV was the only comfort in the looming shadows, and he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder more than once. Surely, he thought, he wasn't the only 30-year-old who felt this way. After the movie, he brushed his teeth, turned off all the lights, and climbed into bed. Sleep came easily at first, but around 1 a.m., he jolted awake, uncertain why. Then he heard a voice downstairs. It sounded like his sister, as if she were inside the house. Confused, he recognized her voice calling for him, but he knew she wasn't home. Groggy and disoriented, Mark assumed she must be arguing with her boyfriend. He got out of bed, stepping into the pitch-black hallway. Flicking on the lights, he made his way through the living room, hearing her voice again, clearer now, saying his name. "Is that you?" he called back, trying to sound casual, but there was no response. He fumbled for the light switch in the foyer, but in his daze, he couldn't find it. Walking down the narrow hallway toward her kitchen, he finally located it and flipped it on. The kitchen light slowly brightened, illuminating the space, but it revealed no one, neither his sister nor her boyfriend. He checked her bedroom, but it was empty. "Hello?" he shouted, but silence answered. Just then he heard something drop to the floor in the very room he'd just checked. Panic surged as he dashed back upstairs, feeling like a scared child. Grabbing his phone, he tried calling her, but there was no answer. Locking himself in his room, he wondered if he had simply imagined everything. Eventually, exhaustion took over and he fell asleep. In the morning, he woke to a text from his sister asking why he had called her at 1 a.m. He responded, asking if she had been home the night before. She replied that she hadn't. She was at her boyfriend's house. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he went downstairs to check her bedroom again, but there was nothing to explain the noise he had heard. He wanted to convince himself that he had hallucinated the entire event, but the alternative was far more terrifying. He had never experienced anything like that before, and the vividness of his sister's voice haunted him. Growing up, Mark often found himself home alone due to his mother's demanding job as a nurse and his brother being away at college. One weekend night, he had a friend named Molly over. They chatted and watched a couple of movies until she had to leave because her parents didn't like her out late. Alone again, Mark continued watching TV in his room. His bedroom overlooked the backyard, and suddenly, he heard the sound of a chair dragging across the deck. Curious, he got up and peeked out the window, only to see a figure sitting on one of the chairs below. Initially thinking it was Molly returning, he called her name, but the person looked up. It wasn't her. Panic shot through him. He backed away from the window, heart racing. Texting a few friends to see if one of them was playing a prank, His fears were confirmed when they all replied with confusion. They weren't anywhere near his house. Terrified but still curious, he cautiously approached the window again, and the figure remained there, looking directly at him. It was a man, and Mark felt certain he had been seen. In a rush, he darted away from the window and turned off the TV. Curling up in his bed, he wrapped his arms around his knees, waiting in darkness. He didn't want to turn on his phone, fearing the light would give away his location. He sat completely still, convinced that any movement would alert the man outside. After what felt like an eternity, he finally mustered the courage to look out again. To his horror, the man was still there, staring up at him. "What do you want?" Mark called out, trying to sound brave. He noticed the man's shoulders shaking, as if he were laughing, though there were no actual sounds. A slight whistling escaped him, suggesting a wheezing laugh. Mark's heart pounded as he repeated, "Please go away," and stepped back from the window. Fearful, Mark hesitated to call the police. Instead, he left his room and sat at the top of the stairway, listening intently. Suddenly, he heard the back door being pushed. The man was trying to get in. Mark bolted back to his room, panic surging through him. At just 14 years old, he felt utterly helpless. Eventually, he heard the front door being fiddled with as well. The man was attempting to force it open. Thankfully, he gave up quickly. Mark hurried to close his bedroom window and curtains, heart racing. If the doors hadn't been locked, he knew he could have easily been killed or kidnapped. He stayed in his room until his mom returned around 9. When he told her what happened, her reaction was one of anger for not calling 911. Looking back, Mark realized how foolish he had been, questioning many of his decisions from that night. That night marked the most intense experience of his life, a night filled with fear and uncertainty. He was only 10 when another frightening incident occurred. He remembered it vividly. His older brother was 14, and his little sister was just 5. On a Friday night, while his brother was out causing trouble, Mark was in his room playing a Star Wars video game when he heard his mom start crying on the phone. Terrified, he rushed to see what was wrong. His mother was on the line with the hospital, informing her that his brother had been hit by a car. The news shattered the family, and they were all visibly shaken. His brother's leg was broken, but Mark couldn't recall the rest of the conversation. His parents hurriedly dressed and fetched his little sister, asking if he could stay home alone. He agreed, worried but relieved he didn't have to see his brother in a bad condition. Before leaving, his dad tried to calm his mom, insisting his brother would be okay. Mark felt reassured by his father's confidence, believing his mom was overreacting, as mothers often do. As the hours passed, he played his game until he heard the front door open. By then, it was well past midnight, and he turned off the TV and PlayStation, crawling into bed with his Game Boy. Straining to hear any familiar voices, he felt the mounting dread when silence enveloped the house. After a few minutes of waiting, he sensed something was wrong. Quietly, he opened his door and peered over the banister that overlooked the living room. The lights were off, but there were 3 tall figures standing in the room. They weren't his family. Petrified, he froze, unable to move. He quietly retreated back into his room, shutting the door as silently as he could, but he knew it wasn't quiet enough. They must have heard it click. In a panic, he dashed to his closet, opened it, and slipped inside, covering himself with boxes and clothes, praying he wouldn't be seen. Time stood still as he awaited the inevitable. He could hear footsteps entering his room, but he didn't dare look up. The door opened, and he sat in silence, heart pounding. It felt like an eternity before the door finally closed, and the footsteps retreated. When he finally looked up, he realized he might have been visible from his hiding spot. An hour later, he heard his parents return. He rushed downstairs to them, only to discover that the front door had been left ajar, and several variables had been taken from their house. That night had spiraled from bad to worse for the family. In their rush to leave for the hospital, his parents hadn't locked the door, and Mark felt incredibly lucky to have escaped unharmed. Reflecting on those moments, he often wondered if the intruder had seen him hiding. Maybe he was just a thief, not out to harm anyone. Or perhaps Mark had narrowly escaped something much darker. The questions lingered, leaving an imprint of fear that would stay with him for years to come. Story 4. The Uninvited Guest. On a quiet autumn evening, Jake sat in his small house on the edge of town, enjoying the serenity that surrounded him. Visitors were a rarity in his secluded neighborhood, so when he heard a soft knock at the door, it pulled him from his thoughts. Peering through the peephole, he saw a woman standing on his porch, drenched by the rain. She looked lost and desperate, her expression pleading for assistance. Despite his better judgment, Jake opened the door. "Can I help you?" he asked, noticing the tremble in her hands and the worry etched on her face. "My car broke down just down the road. Could I come in to call for help?" After a moment's hesitation, Jake stepped aside, allowing her entry. As she crossed the threshold, a chill swept through the room, making him shiver involuntarily. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled out her phone, but it seemed unable to connect. As moments stretched into minutes, an uneasy feeling settled deep in Jake's stomach. He watched as the woman's gaze lingered on the family photos lining the walls, particularly one of his late grandmother. "She was such a lovely woman," the visitor said, her eyes glistening with an unsettling intensity. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Jake felt a rush of cold air envelop him. "I think you should go," he urged, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising panic. The woman turned her attention toward him, a smile creeping across her lips, but it was devoid of warmth. "But I haven't finished my visit yet." In a surge of fear, Jake rushed toward the door, but it slammed shut as if held by an unseen force. The woman's expression darkened, and in that moment, Jake realized she was not just a lost traveler. She was something far more sinister, an entity that had stepped beyond the veil of the ordinary. As shadows closed in around him, Jake knew he had to escape. The inviting autumn evening had transformed into a night of dread, and he faced the chilling truth that he was no longer the master of his own home. Story 5. Whispers from the Woods. Biden was home alone for an entire week during his teenage years, a rare occurrence since his parents seldom went out. His mother's wealthy friend, Patty, had invited his parents on an all-expenses-paid trip, leaving Biden as the only occupant of their house. They lived in Newark, Ohio, in Licking County, a name that always drew a chuckle from visitors. Their home was nestled near woods, located on a quiet road that saw only a few cars pass each day. The backyard boasted a spacious deck overlooking the trees, a decent expanse of grass, a small fish pond, and an above-ground swimming pool. On a Thursday night in July 2013, Biden was out on the deck, enjoying some music while smoking weed. That's when he first thought he heard a voice coming from the woods. Lowering the music, he strained to listen, but it didn't repeat. Shrugging it off, he turned the volume back up. Yet, when the music blared again, the voice returned, prompting him to turn it off completely and listen more carefully. A male voice called out, "Hey, over here." It was distant, but close enough to send a shiver down Biden's spine. The woods were only about 20 to 30 yards away, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, he dismissed the voice as just kids playing manhunt or something similar. But then the voice called again. "Hey, over here, we need help." This time, Biden realized the tone was too deep for a child, and the phrase, "we need help," raised alarm bells in his mind. Unease washed over him as he wondered if the calls were meant for him. Then he heard, "Straight in front of you, please come help us," and the voice seemed to be coming from right in front of him in the woods. A knot formed in his stomach as he felt the urgency of the situation. Reluctantly, he called back, "Who is that?" The response came, "We just need help. We're stuck in the woods." Biden asked, "What does that mean?" The voice replied, "Just please come help, straight in front of you." Against his better judgment, he stood up, walked down the steps of the deck, and stepped onto the grass, heading toward the woods. "I'm coming. Where are you?" he shouted. The voice responded instantly, "Right in front of you. I see you." "Wait, are you alone or with someone?" Biden called back. This time there was silence. He halted midway to the woods, a sinking feeling growing in his gut. Slowly, he began to walk backwards, returning to the safety of the house and the deck, feeling the unsettling realization that something was very wrong. Once back on the deck, the voice remained quiet. If it were real and they truly saw him, they would have said something like, "Where are you going?" At the very least, they would know he was onto them. How many people were out there? 1, 3? The thought of anyone being stuck in the woods made no sense, especially if they could see him. Did they get caught on a branch or something? Biden hurried inside and locked all the doors for safety. He sat in the living room for a while, still high, which might have contributed to his initial trust. But then he heard the voice again, this time closer, definitely in the backyard rather than the woods. He heard splashing water, perhaps from the pool or the pond. Rushing to the window, he looked out and initially saw nothing. Then the voice called out again, "I see you," accompanied by a laugh. He spotted a figure of at least one man hidden behind the pool, only his head visible. It was too dark to make out anything more than his dark, medium-length hair. Biden quickly closed the blinds and tried to ignore the situation, hoping the man would lose interest. He suspected the stranger was a sick, deranged individual who enjoyed tormenting others, and he didn't want to give him the satisfaction of attention. But his resolve crumbled when he heard aggressive banging on the window where he had just closed the blinds. The man was screaming, "Help!" In a panic, Biden screamed at the top of his lungs, "Shut up, you freak! The police are coming!" He repeated it over and over, trying to sound crazier than the man outside. He heard the laughter from the other side of the glass, which gradually faded away as the man presumably walked off. Trembling and out of breath, Biden sank back onto the couch, sitting there for a while until he felt the tension ease, convinced the man had given up. Despite the night's events, Biden managed to get a good night's sleep, aided by the weed. He couldn't help but wonder if he would have reacted differently if he hadn't been high. The whole experience left him more paranoid about who he might open his door to in the future. Story 6. Unexpected Intruder. Alice, a 23-year-old living at home with her parents, had an unsettling experience one afternoon while playing basketball in her front yard. As she dribbled the ball, she glanced up at one of the upstairs windows and saw a woman standing there, someone she didn't recognize. It wasn't her mom or her sister. It was a complete stranger. When the woman noticed Alice looking at her, she quickly disappeared from view. Intrigued and a bit frightened, Alice rushed inside to check the lounge room, but there was no sign of the woman. She searched every room in the house, all the bedrooms, the bathroom, and every closet. Even the downstairs areas of the living room, kitchen, dining room, and another bedroom received her thorough inspection. Finally, she headed to the basement, where she doubted the woman could be hiding. The basement was small, furnished with a couple of couches, a bar, and 2 closets, leaving few places for someone to conceal themselves. When Alice opened the second closet door, a wave of fear washed over her. She could think of no other hiding spots. With a swift motion, she yanked the door open, ready to confront whatever was inside. Pushing herself into the closet, she expected the worst, but all she found was a jumble of coats and hangers. Confused but resolute, she refused to question her sanity. She had clearly seen that woman. Returning to the main floor, Alice shouted at the top of her lungs for the intruder to leave her home. Her shout was so loud it drew the attention of her next-door neighbor, who hurried over to check on her. She recounted the bizarre encounter, and he agreed to help her search the house again. When they found nothing, Alice concluded that the woman must have slipped out through the back door, which she had unlocked earlier to retrieve the basketball. After her neighbor left, Alice locked all the doors and called her parents to share the unsettling story. Although they were concerned, they asked her to ensure that nothing had been stolen. She did a thorough check and was relieved to find that all valuables remained untouched. Later that night, Alice struggled to fall asleep, her mind racing with the day's events. Most people couldn't relate to seeing a stranger at their window, which only added to her anxiety. However, her restless state would soon prove to be fortuitous. As she began to drift off, she heard strange noises coming from the other side of the room. The fan above her created a constant hum, which masked the initial sounds. But as they grew louder and more distinct, Alice turned to her side and gasped. The woman from earlier was emerging from under her bed. Panicking, Alice screamed even louder than before. Instinctively, she jumped out of bed and tackled the woman to the floor, grabbing her throat and demanding to know who she was. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was her neighbor again. Without a second thought, Alice dragged the woman to the front door, despite her struggles and desperate scratching. Alice still bore scars on her right arm from the woman's claws. Opening the front door, she called for her neighbor to help. He rushed in, and together they managed to restrain the woman while Alice dialed the police. As they waited for help to arrive, the woman screamed and cursed at them, her behavior erratic and frantic. She resembled someone suffering from severe drug withdrawal. When the police finally showed up, one of the officers recognized her immediately. They had dealt with her multiple times before. Her name was ironically Karen. Alice felt a strange sense of satisfaction as she watched the officers take her away in the back of a police car. After thanking her neighbor for his prompt assistance, Alice returned to her room. Though her mind continued to race, she felt a newfound sense of relief mixed with a lingering thrill. It was a feeling she couldn't quite explain, but it was there nonetheless. Story 7. The Intruder. Growing up, Jake was raised in rural Michigan. There was hardly anything to do. If someone enjoyed staring at trees and crops and having plenty of alone time, that was the place to be. He escaped as soon as he got a car and enough money to move. Though he appreciated nature, he would choose the vibrancy of a big city any day. His parents no longer owned that property. They had sold it 5 years ago. The property had been a 3-acre expanse, with a sizable house and a storage building out back. At 13, Jake often found himself alone. His parents trusted him because he had matured early and taken on responsibilities around the property. One weekend, while playing Vice City on his PS2 in the living room, he heard a loud metallic bang from outside. Curious, he rushed to every window, trying to see what was happening. It wasn't until he reached the window overlooking the storage building that he noticed the door was wide open. Without hesitation, he grabbed the rifle from the closet and headed outside. He called out, "Who's in there?" but received no response. When he reached the door, he announced his possession of a gun before looking inside. The storage building held a plethora of items: a sit-down mower, a quad, and countless lawn care tools. Someone could have been hiding behind any of those. Even as a child, Jake was not easily frightened, but a wave of unease washed over him. He closed the door and returned to the house, locking it behind him. He sat by the window for what felt like an eternity, watching the storage building, half expecting the door to swing open again. That door was heavy and couldn't just open by itself. Someone had definitely come in. He wondered if that someone was still inside. Deciding to reach out for help, Jake called his dad on the landline. When he didn't pick up, Jake left a voicemail back in those days when texting wasn't the norm. Afterward, he returned to his post by the window, this time turning on a TV show to break the monotony. He took the phone with him, feeling increasingly anxious. Just as he was about to give up hope, he heard creaking from upstairs. His heart raced. Was he working himself up, or was someone truly in the house? He adopted a guard dog mentality. Even if he didn't love living there, it was his home, and he felt responsible for protecting it. But now he realized he was in over his head. He grabbed the rifle again and cautiously walked upstairs, choosing silence over calling out. He didn't want to alert a potential intruder. At the top of the stairs, he turned on the light in the hallway. There were 5 closed doors. 4 led to bedrooms and 1 to the bathroom. Each door had a noticeable crack underneath, allowing him a glimpse below. Jake remembered the creaking sound he'd heard moments earlier coming from the side of the house where his parents' bedroom was located. He got down on his knees and peered under the door. To his horror, he saw 2 bare feet facing away from him. His stomach twisted into a knot. The reality of the situation hit him hard. He wasn't ready to confront or, God forbid, shoot someone. Panic setting in, he quickly descended the stairs and hid in the bathroom to call his dad again. Still no answer. After multiple attempts, Jake finally called 911. He whispered into the phone, detailing everything that was happening. The operator instructed him to stay quiet and wait. He heard footsteps coming down the stairs, then approaching the bathroom door, as if the intruder knew exactly where he had gone. The footsteps stopped, and there was a brief pause before a deep voice asked, "What's up, kid?" Jake remembered that voice and those words vividly. Even today, he would recognize it immediately. Fear gripped him, and he felt the urge to cry. Ignoring the operator's instructions, he replied, "I'm on the phone with the cops right now, and I have a gun." He put the operator on speaker as she asked if everything was okay. The man tried to open the door, and when he found it locked, Jake heard him walk away. The footsteps faded into silence, followed by the sound of a door slamming the back door. A wave of relief washed over him as he waited for the police to arrive. When they finally arrived, it felt like 1,000,000 pounds had lifted off his shoulders. After thoroughly inspecting the house and confirming that the man was gone, they asked if there was anywhere else he could stay that night. Jake replied that he could stay at his uncle's house. They contacted his uncle, who arrived and spoke with the police before taking Jake back to his place. What haunted Jake the most was the realization that it was his fault. He could have prevented this. He had left the door unlocked while he went to investigate the storage building, allowing the man to walk right into the house. Even with a rifle in hand, he hadn't felt safe. It was truly the most terrifying experience of his life. Story 8. The Stranger at the Door. Sam was home alone one night for a reason he couldn't remember. All he knew was that his entire family was gone. At 15 or 16 years old, he was a big gamer, obsessed with StarCraft. Admittedly, he sometimes spent a weekend night or two playing StarCraft or other PC games. This was right before the lockdown started. He was deeply immersed in a game on his computer in his bedroom on the first floor when the doorbell rang. Hurrying to the door, Sam didn't want to be away from the game for too long, fearing he might lose. When he reached the front door, he called out, "Who is it?" A soft, weak voice on the other side replied, but he couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a woman. He opened the door, with the storm door still separating him from an older woman standing outside, a big smile plastered on her face and her hands hidden behind her back. "Can I help you?" Sam asked through the door. The woman said she needed to use a phone and asked if she could come inside. From a young age, he had been taught not to let strangers into the house, regardless of their appearance. Yet, he felt awkward, unsure how to turn her away. Redirecting her to the library a few blocks down, he thought they'd surely have a phone. Deep down, he knew the library was closed at this hour, but he just wanted the stranger trying to enter his house to leave. The woman continued to smile, but what she said next did not match her cheerful demeanor. "That's very rude to turn away an old lady asking for help," she remarked. Sam, feeling cornered, explained that his parents didn't allow strangers into the house. It was a house rule. As he slowly started to close the door, saying sorry, she stood there, unmoving but still smiling. Yet to Sam, her smile suddenly felt much more menacing. Walking back to his room, the doorbell rang again. There was no way Sam was going to open the door again. That woman had given off weird vibes from the start. Perhaps something was wrong with her, or maybe she wasn't all there. He had no way of knowing, and it felt selfish to send her away, but he simply couldn't open the door to anyone while home alone. Returning to his game, Sam settled back in, but not long after, he heard something tapping on the window. The sound was a clicking noise from something metal. The window was directly in front of his desk, and with the blinds pulled down, he couldn't see what was making the noise, but he already had a sinking feeling. His room was the only one in the house lit up, and the horrifying thought that it was the old woman from before sent a chill down his spine. He turned off the sound on his computer. At this point, the game didn't matter anymore. the clanking sound persisted. Frustrated, he muttered to himself, "Forget this," and moved to a different room in the house. He sat in the darkness of the living room for a bit when the doorbell rang again. This woman was now harassing him. He tried to convince himself she wasn't a threat, just a confused old lady. But when she rang the doorbell a second and third time, he decided to open the door and ask if there was someone he could call for her. However, when he opened the door, a man stood on the other side. He looked to be about 10 years younger than the woman. "Have you seen my mother?" he asked through the storm door. Sam replied, "Yes, she came to my door just before." The man apologized and explained that his mother had dementia and had wandered off. Sam suddenly felt a pang of guilt, but when the man asked if he could come inside for a minute, Sam felt awkward again. Why did he need to come inside? He repeated what he had told the woman. They could just talk through the door. He mentioned he thought she might have gone into the backyard since he heard something at his window. He told the man he could check out back. The man thanked him and walked down the walkway. Sam assumed he went into the backyard, but when he looked out the back window, expecting to see him searching, he saw nobody, neither the man nor his mother. This was all too strange for him. That night, Sam went to bed early, falling asleep with the TV on in the background until he heard the unmistakable tapping sound on the window again. Something metal was tapping against the glass. Remembering the concerned man, he decided to try and help. He went to the window, lifted the blinds, and saw the woman outside, still wearing that creepy smile. She was tapping a kitchen knife on his window. Panic surged through him as he quickly closed the blinds and crawled back into bed. This felt surreal, like a nightmare. A suspiciously short time later, the doorbell rang repeatedly 4 times in quick succession. The clinking on the window stopped. Everything felt too suspicious. It seemed like a robbery attempt. He ignored the doorbell and stayed huddled in bed, determined to wait it out. Without a cell phone at that time, and being a somewhat socially awkward guy, he didn't want to call the police for some reason. He waited until the noises finally ceased. The next morning, he called his dad and recounted the strange events. His dad praised him for not opening the door, saying he had been smart. Everyone agreed that the whole situation sounded like an attempted robbery. Was there a chance that the woman really did have dementia and that the man was her concerned son? Maybe, but it all seemed too coordinated. Why did he want to come into the house? How did he know she had been at Sam's house specifically? Why didn't he ever go into the backyard to look for her when Sam offered? Too many unanswered questions led Sam to believe he had avoided something terrible by not opening that door. As he mentioned at the start of the video, a week ago while recording this, something happened to him personally that inspired him to revisit this theme. His friend Cody had asked him to watch his dog, Theo, for the night. Theo was a little pomsky and barked a lot. When he started barking like crazy at something going on outside, Sam didn't pay much attention, aside from telling him to be quiet a few times. But when Theo went to the back door and kept barking, Sam figured he wanted to go outside. He approached the back door to open it, but as he got close, he realized someone was trying to open it from the outside. Peering through the screen door, he was startled to see another man looking right back at him. This was in the backyard, which was already alarming, and he didn't recognize him as a family member of Cody's. "Who are you?" Sam asked, trying to sound firm. The man responded by asking if he had seen Melissa. Melissa was Cody's younger sister, in her 20s, but this guy looked like he was in his mid-50s and appeared homeless. Sam told him he needed to leave. There was no Melissa living there. The man replied, "Are you sure?" Sam insisted. "Yeah, you need to leave, you hupper. There are cameras all over the property." The man left immediately after that. Getting him to leave was easy, but when Cody asked his sister who that guy could have been, she said she had no idea. The man looked like he was 55, drunk and filthy, not exactly someone Cody's sister would associate with. The fact that he had approached the back door and tried to let himself in was genuinely terrifying. One could only imagine what he might have intended for Melissa. It was a stark reminder of why so many of these stories could be avoided by simply keeping doors locked.
Above is a collection of stories about uninvited guests who come knocking at your door. Could someone be hiding under your bed right now? If you enjoyed the story, support us so we can grow and bring you more in the future. See you in the next video.